The morning she returned to Ashvale, the lane was exactly as she remembered. Narrow, overhung by oaks whose roots had lifted the gravel in 3 places, the limestone gateposts still wearing their mossy caps. Eleanor Vane did not slow the hired conveyance. She had not come back to remember. She had come back because the deed was in her possession, signed and witnessed and sealed, and because the solicitor's letter had said, in the dry language of lawful transfer, that Ashvale Park and all its dependencies were now hers. The coachman set her and her small trunk down at the foot of the drive, accepted his coin, and turned the horses back toward the village without remark. Eleanor stood in the October cold with her trunk at her feet and the gateposts behind her, and the long drive ahead, and she breathed. She was 28 years old. When she had last stood on this drive, she had been 21, and the child in her arms now was not yet a thought, but was already a consequence. She had stood in this same October cold, in a different coat, with a different trunk, and been told by Mrs. Harrow, the housekeeper, the woman who had governed this house with the quiet authority of someone who believed her employer's word was the word of God, that her services were no longer required, and that a hired carriage had been arranged. No notice, no reference. 1 month's wages folded into an envelope that had not been warm from anyone's hand. She had not wept then. She picked up her trunk now as she had picked it up then, and walked toward the house. A woman appeared at the side door before Eleanor reached it, young, perhaps 19, in a plain dress and an apron, a kitchen maid by the look of her. She pulled up short at the sight of a stranger walking the drive with a trunk, and her expression moved through surprise and then settled, as young faces do, into a kind of waiting. "I am Miss Vane," Eleanor said. "I believe the household was informed to expect me." The girl bobbed her head and held the door open, and Eleanor crossed the threshold into Ashvale for the first time in 7 years. The entrance hall smelled of beeswax and old stone, exactly as it always had. The flagging was the same. The staircase rose to the same landing, where a window gave onto the park, and the pale afternoon light came through it at the same angle it always had in October. Eleanor set her trunk beside the bottom step and stood still for a moment inside the smell and the light. Then she removed her gloves, 1 finger at a time, and folded them into her coat pocket. There was work to do. The estate's accounts had not been properly kept in 3 years. She had seen the summary. She knew exactly where to begin. She did not think about him. She had not let herself think about him in a very long time, and she saw no reason to begin now. The estate agent arrived at 10 the following morning, a thin man named Peabody, who wore his discomfort with Eleanor's existence as legal owner of Ashvale in a permanent slight tightening about the mouth. He laid the accounts ledgers on the library table without ceremony, and answered her questions with the careful politeness of a man who has received instructions to be cooperative and has decided to interpret that word narrowly. "The western fields have been let," he said when Eleanor asked about the tenant arrangement. 3 years, the rents have been collected. "And posted to the estate account?" A pause. "In the main." Eleanor looked at him until he produced a supplementary ledger. She opened it. The column of figures told a story that did not require Peabody's commentary. She asked no further questions about it, made a note in the small book she carried in her apron pocket, and moved on to the maintenance records. She was still working when she heard, through the library window, the sound of a horse on the gravel. She did not look up. Arrivals were not her concern until they came inside. She turned a page and went on reading the maintenance records, which were nearly as eloquent as the rent ledgers in what they had chosen to omit. The plastering in the upper east wing had not been touched. The well in the stable yard needed new lining. 3 sash windows in the south face had frames so rotten the glazier had written a note in the margin of his invoice rather than return to replace them. The knock at the library door came when she was halfway through the glazier's note. "Come," she said without looking up. The door opened. She heard two sets of footsteps, the kitchen maid's light tread, and then another tread, heavier, deliberate, the walk of a man who had learned to move in large rooms and had never quite unlearned it. She looked up. He was taller than she remembered. The coat was plain wool, the kind a land steward or a prosperous farmer's son might wear in the country, well made but without ornament. And he had let himself into the library with the ease of a man who had no reason to believe he would not be admitted. His hair was the same dark brown, shorter now than it had been, and his face had acquired 7 years of weather and something else, something harder and quieter that she could not immediately name. He was perhaps 30. She had not known his age when she had known him. She had not known a great many things. The kitchen maid said, "A Mr. Hartley, miss. He says he's known to the estate." Eleanor held his gaze for a moment. His expression was perfectly composed. She could read nothing in it except that he had come prepared for her to receive him, and that he had not expected her to be sitting at the library table with 3 open ledgers and a page of glazier's notes. "Thank you, Bess," Eleanor said. "You may go." The girl withdrew. The door closed. The library was quiet except for the small sounds of the fire. "Miss Vane," he said. "Mr. Hartley." She let the name sit. She had used the name he had given her, the name the household had used for him, when he had arrived 2 months before she left, presenting himself to Mr. Ashworth, the old master, long since gone to his grave, as a man interested in the management of a working estate. A gentleman farmer, the servants had called him, which was what they called men of unclear station and unremarkable dress, who did not behave as if the world's opinion of them was particularly interesting. "Sit down, if you like. I have rather a long list of questions for Mr. Peabody's attention, and I suspect some of them may concern you." He sat. He did not make the usual noises about the estate, about the surprise of her return, about the extraordinary nature of her acquisition. She had been prepared to receive those observations and set them aside. He produced none of them. He sat in the chair across from her with his hands loose on the arms and his eyes on her face and said, "How is the child?" She did not let herself react. She turned one page, then another, and set the ledger closed. "He is well." "A boy?" "Yes." "Does he—" He stopped. He set his hands flat on the arms of the chair. "Forgive me, that is not what I came to ask." "What did you come to ask?" He looked at the fire for a moment. When he looked back at her, his expression had changed. Not softened exactly, but opened, the way a man's face opens when he has decided to say the thing rather than the manageable version of the thing. "I came," he said, "because I saw the solicitor's notice in the village, and because it was your name on it, and because I needed to know whether you were well." Eleanor said nothing. She had learned in 7 years, when silence did the work, a sentence could not. If you would stay a little longer, the story will tell you why silence was the most she could safely offer him, and why he had learned to read it. The autumn wore on. She did not ask him to leave, and he did not go. This was not warmth precisely. It was the logic of the estate, which needed someone who knew its land and its history, and he had learned both during his months as Mr. Hartley of no particular account. She hired him in that capacity officially through Peabody, and paid him a fair wage out of the estate account, and did not meet his eyes across the breakfast room more often than was necessary. The kitchen garden needed attention before the first hard frost. The well in the stable yard needed its new lining before December. There was a great deal of work to do, and work was something she had always understood better than feeling. She managed the accounts in the library every morning. She walked the fields in the afternoons, She hired a girl from the village to look after James during the hours when Eleanor was occupied with Peabody or with the new tenant agreements. A quiet child herself, gentle with the boy's shyness, and patient with his habit of sitting very still in corners and watching everything that moved. James was 6 years old, brown-haired like his mother, with a seriousness in his face that was already distinct and recognizable as character rather than age. He did not ask about his father. Eleanor had prepared, carefully and privately, for the day when he would. She was in the kitchen garden on a Thursday afternoon in November when Mr. Hartley found her or came to be near her, which was the more honest way of describing the way these things tended to happen at Ashvale. He was repairing a section of the stone wall at the garden's north edge, moving the loose stones with the particular economy of a man who has done physical work enough to know how to spare his hands, and she was cutting back the last of the rosemary. They worked for a time without speaking. The sky was the flat white of late November, and the cold had a texture to it, not sharp yet, but settling, the kind that presaged frost. "The west gate latch needs replacing," he said, without looking up from the wall. "I know," she said. "I have written to the ironmonger." A beat of quiet. "Peabody won't tell you, so I will. The Northfield drainage has been neglected for at least 4 years. It will flood in a heavy winter." She stopped cutting. "How do you know?" "Because I walked it with Mr. Ashworth 7 years ago, and he said it wanted attention then, and I see no evidence it received any." She looked at him. He was still looking at the wall, pressing a stone into place with the flat of his hand. His coat was dusty from the stone, and his hands were reddened from the cold. And there was something so familiar in the set of his shoulders, in the way he stood inside the physical work of the estate, as if it were a language he had learned young and never lost, that she had to look away before the familiarity became more than she could manage. "You walked the fields with Mr. Ashworth," she said carefully. "Several times. In your capacity as a gentleman farmer interested in estate management." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Yes." She cut one more sprig of rosemary. Then she set the knife down on the wall and turned to face him. "Mr. Hartley," she said, "what is it that you are not telling me?" He looked at her then, directly, and she saw something in his face she had not seen before. Not guilt exactly, but the particular expression of a man who has carried a thing for a long time and has just been asked to put it down. "Several things," he said, "none of them simple." She picked up the knife and the rosemary and walked back to the house without answering him. She had learned in 7 years the exact cost of believing a man when he sounded like he meant it. It was the housekeeper who told her. Not intentionally. She was Mrs. Clegg now, brought in from the village by Peabody, when Mrs. Harrow had finally retired, and she had no particular knowledge of Eleanor's history at Ashvale beyond what the village knew, that the new mistress had once been employed here and had come back rather unexpectedly as its owner, which was the sort of story people in villages told with varying degrees of sympathy, depending on whom you asked. Mrs. Clegg was a practical woman who asked no questions she did not need the answers to, and Eleanor had liked her from the first week. She had gone to the morning room to retrieve a household account book she had left on the writing desk, and she found it still there, but beside it was a letter she had not left. An open letter, face upward, still unfolded, written in a hand she did not know. She would not have read it except that it had been left on the writing desk in a room she used, and except that the first line her eye fell on was in a hand she associated with Peabody, and except that the first line was her name. She did not sit down. She stood beside the writing desk and read the letter where it lay. It was from a solicitor in London, not Peabody's firm. It was addressed to a name she did not know, the Earl of Ashmore. It concerned the estate of Ashvale Park, its recent conveyance, and the question of whether the conveyance had been properly executed given the interests of the estate's prior claimants. It used words like prior right and settled entail and lawful heir with the ease of a man who had written many such letters. And it referred in one passage near the end to the Earl of Ashmore's presence at the estate in his current capacity, and to the question of whether that presence served the interests of a prompt and amicable resolution. Eleanor read that passage twice. Then she folded the letter carefully back to its original creases, laid it on the desk exactly as she had found it, and walked out of the morning room and down the corridor to the kitchen, where she asked Bess, with perfect steadiness, to bring her a cup of tea to the library. She sat with the tea for 20 minutes. She did not drink it. She held the cup and let herself feel, with full attention, the specific quality of having been made a fool of twice by the same person in the same decade, and the particular loneliness of understanding that she had been right to trust nothing, and that being right was not a comfort in the smallest degree. Then she set the cup down, opened the top ledger, and went back to work. He found her in the library again that evening. She did not look up. She heard the door, heard his tread, heard him stop somewhere behind her left shoulder. "You went into the morning room," he said. "Not a question. It is my morning room," she said. "I go into it whenever I like." A silence. Then, quietly, "Eleanor." She had not heard him use her name before, not the name, not that version of it, not in that register. She kept her eyes on the ledger. "I believe," she said, "that I should be addressing you as my lord." Another silence, longer this time. "Yes." "How long?" "I was not—" He stopped. She heard him cross to the other side of the table and sit, and she finally looked up, because she was not the kind of woman who hid from things she needed to see. He was looking at his hands. "I was not concealing myself from you specifically," he said. "I came to Ashvale because my uncle, the previous earl, the man who left the estate in the condition it is now in, because I had reason to believe the estate was being mismanaged, and I could not walk in as Ashmore without every record and every account being arranged in anticipation of my arrival. I needed to see the reality of it. I had done this before at 2 other properties. It was not a stratagem aimed at you." "No," she said. "You simply aimed other things at me." His jaw tightened. "What was done to you was not my doing. When I learned of it, I had already—" He stopped again. "I was not in England. My uncle had sent a letter through his solicitor. I did not know the contents of it until 6 months after you had already gone. And then I tried to find you, for 3 years." He looked up, and she did not look away, because she had promised herself she would not. "The agency my uncle used would not give me the name of the household they had placed you with. It took until this year when the estate passed to me, and I could compel the records." Eleanor was quiet for a long time. The fire was low. Outside, the wind had come up and was working at one of the south windows with the loose frame she had not yet had replaced. "The letter in the morning room," she said. "My solicitor is anxious. He believes there may be a challenge to the conveyance. He is wrong. The deed is clean, and you hold it lawfully, and I told him so when he wrote to me, which he apparently did not adequately hear." Something shifted in his face. "Ashvale is yours. I have no interest in disputing it." "You have every legal interest in disputing it." "I have the legal standing," he said. "I have no interest." She stood and went to the window. The park was dark beyond the glass, and the reflection that came back to her was her own face, unreadable as it had always been when she was holding something carefully. "You said," she said, "that you needed to know whether I was well." "Yes." "That was what you came for." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "The boy's name is James. He is 6 years old. He has your eyes, which I have not told him and do not intend to, until I have decided what to tell him." She heard him draw breath, and she kept her gaze on the dark park. You may not make a claim on him. You may, if you conduct yourself in every respect as a man who has earned the right to be trusted, eventually come to deserve an introduction. Those are my terms. They are not negotiable. He said nothing for a long time. When he spoke, it was only, yes, those are fair terms. She turned back from the window. He was still at the table, still looking at his hands, and the firelight was low on his face. And she thought, with the specific clarity that came to her when she was at her most tired, that fairness was a beginning and not an end. The letter from Mrs. Harrow arrived 3 weeks later. Eleanor had not sought it. It had been sent. Mrs. Harrow was in Bath now, retired to lodgings paid for by a small annuity the old Earl had settled on her, and the letter was 2 pages in a sharp, practised hand, and contained across those 2 pages a full account of what had happened in the autumn of 1817. The old Earl had known. He had known from the month after Eleanor arrived that his nephew came to Ashvale for reasons that were not purely about the estate accounts. He had watched, Mrs. Harrow wrote, and he had not approved, which was the word she used, though Eleanor read through it to the thing she meant, which was that a woman in Eleanor's position had no standing in his household and no claims on his nephew's future that an earl would recognize. He had instructed Mrs. Harrow to remove the problem quietly, which she had done. She had not told the nephew. She had told him only that the governess had found a better situation and had departed without notice, which was a story he had apparently believed because he had no reason not to, and because the man who told it to him was his uncle. Eleanor read the letter twice, then folded it, then sat with it folded in her hands for a while. She was not surprised. She had long since reconstructed the outline of this from the evidence available to her, and the letter only confirmed it in writing and gave it Mrs. Harrow's particular name for her own role, which was duty. She was, she found, less angry than she had expected. She was tired of anger in the way you grow tired of an old coat that has kept you warm for years, and that no longer fits exactly, but that you have not known how to put down. She sat with the folded letter and let herself understand that the old Earl was dead, and Mrs. Harrow was in Bath, and the thing that had been done to her 7 years ago was done and could not be undone, and that what she held in her hands now was Ashvale, free and clear, and a boy who was going to need more of her attention than she had given him in the last several weeks. She wrote back to Mrs. Harrow. The letter was 3 sentences. She did not forgive her. She told her that she had received the account and that she did not intend to trouble her further, and she sealed it without rereading it and gave it to Bess for the post. That evening she brought James down to the kitchen for his supper, which she had been too busy to do in some time, and sat with him while he ate and listened to him describe, in his careful, methodical way, the sparrow he had watched from the schoolroom window all afternoon, which had been building something in the eaves, though he could not be certain what, because the eaves were too high to see into clearly. She watched his face while he talked, the particular seriousness of him, and thought that she had done one thing right in the last 7 years, without any assistance from anyone, which was enough to be going on with. The crisis arrived, as these things do, not as a storm, but as an afternoon call. Lady Hargrove came to Ashvale on a Tuesday in December, with her daughter, Miss Hargrove, and her companion, Mrs. Quill, all 3 in a hired landau with the curtains drawn against the cold, and she presented herself in the entrance hall with the easy authority of a woman who had been entering drawing rooms all her life, and had never once been received with anything less than complete deference. She was tall, dressed in excellent black silk, with a manner that contrived to make every room she stood in feel slightly too small for the people already in it. Eleanor received her in the drawing-room, which she had made presentable over the previous weeks, but which still had the slightly austere quality of a room that had not recently been inhabited for pleasure. "Miss Vane," Lady Hargrove said, settling into the best chair with the unhurriedness of a woman who expected chairs to be the best. "I have been meaning to call since I heard of your circumstances here. It is rather an unusual situation." "I believe it is a quite ordinary one," Eleanor said. "An estate changes hands. The new owner takes possession." "Of course." Lady Hargrove's smile was the kind that carries its edge on the inside. "What is unusual is the history of the situation, which I own I find rather difficult to account for. You were, I understand, previously employed here." "As governess, yes." "And now you hold the deed." The smile settled. "It is the how of it that interests me, Miss Vane. The late Earl's will, I am told, conveyed the Ashvale estate to a Miss Eleanor Vane of Yorkshire, which is, I hope you will forgive my candour, not the kind of bequest one might have anticipated." Eleanor looked at her. There was a small fire in the drawing-room, and the light fell evenly across the carpet. And through the window the park was the grey and rust of December. And Eleanor thought of Mrs. Harrow's letter, and of the old Earl's particular understanding of duty, and of the 7 years she had spent in various lodgings, and in various positions of diminishing comfort, while the woman in front of her had presumably spent those same years calling on people and finding their situations unusual. "The late Earl was a man of particular conscience in the last years of his life," Eleanor said. "The bequest reflects that conscience. If you have questions about the instrument of conveyance, Mr. Peabody's firm has copies. He is most approachable on Tuesdays." Miss Hargrove looked at her hands. Mrs. Quill found something requiring attention in the window. Lady Hargrove's smile cooled by one precise degree. "I am told," she said, "that the Earl of Ashmore is also presently at Ashvale, in some capacity. He is engaged by the estate in a supervisory capacity, yes." "How very extraordinary." Lady Hargrove paused with the timing of a woman who had rehearsed timing. "I imagine he finds it rather irregular to be employed on an estate that was once, or might reasonably have been, his own." "I have not asked him," Eleanor said, "but I expect he finds the estate accounts rather more interesting than the question of irregularity. He has a great deal of practical sense." "Indeed." Lady Hargrove sat forward slightly. "Miss Vane, I will be direct with you as I always am. There are people in this neighbourhood, people of some standing, who find the present arrangement rather difficult to understand, and who believe that a proper resolution of the Ashmore question would be to the benefit of everyone involved, including yourself." Eleanor said nothing. "The Earl is unmarried," Lady Hargrove continued. "He is in want of a suitable connection, one that would naturally restore the proper order of things here at Ashvale." "Lady Hargrove," Eleanor set down her tea. "I am the proper order of things at Ashvale. I hold the deed. There is no resolution required." Into the silence that followed this, the drawing-room door opened. He stood in the doorway in his working coat, still with the look of the grounds on him, and his eye moved from Eleanor to Lady Hargrove, and back to Eleanor, with a composure that was, in that moment, the most useful thing Eleanor had ever seen. He did not apologize for interrupting. He did not lower his gaze. He crossed to the fire and stood beside Eleanor's chair with the simplicity of a man who is where he intends to be. Lady Hargrove had begun a sentence. It ended somewhere around the second syllable. Bess appeared in the doorway behind him, slightly flushed, and said, "I beg your pardon, miss. There is also a Mr. Aldwick to see you. He says he is from Mercer and Son, the London solicitors, and that his business is urgent." The man behind Bess was slight, with a leather satchel and a coat that had spent the last 2 days on a hard road, and he looked from Eleanor to the man standing beside her. And then, with the automatic courtesy of a man who had spent his professional life in rooms with titled people, he said, "Your Grace. I did not know you would be here. Your Grace. Not my lord, not Mr. Hartley, not the Earl of Ashmore, which was the rank Eleanor had been prepared for, which was significant and clear, and which she had already absorbed and set in its proper place in her understanding of him. Your Grace, the address a man's solicitor used for a man who stood higher than an earl. The drawing-room was very quiet. Lady Hargrove's composure, which had been so excellent a thing until this moment, did something she had not planned for it. It flickered. Then it went out. Eleanor looked at him. He had gone quite still. His jaw was set. He looked at Mr. Aldwych in the way a man looks at a person who has said the thing he was not yet ready to say. And then he looked at Eleanor, and his expression was the most honest she had ever seen it. "Duke of Ashmore," he said to her, and only to her, as if Lady Hargrove and Mr. Aldwych and Bess and the whole assembled drawing-room were simply not the relevant audience. "My uncle was an earl. The dukedom came through my grandmother's line. I intended to tell you properly." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Mr. Aldwych, who was holding his satchel and looking extremely uncomfortable, and at Lady Hargrove, who had put down her own cup of tea and appeared to be quietly computing the difference between a woman who held a deed from a dead earl and a woman who held a deed from a dead earl, and was being stood beside in front of witnesses by a duke. "Mr. Aldwych," Eleanor said, "I'm glad you have come. I have some questions about the conveyance that Mr. Peabody has been unable to answer satisfactorily, and I believe a second opinion from a London firm would be of great use." She rose from her chair. "Lady Hargrove, Miss Hargrove, Mrs. Quill, thank you for your visit. Bess will see you to the door." She did not wait for Lady Hargrove's response. She walked toward the library, and she heard, behind her, the sound of his footsteps following. She let him follow. In the library, with the door closed and the ledgers still open on the table, he stood and she stood, and the fire made its small sounds. "A duke?" she said. "Yes." "And you came here as a man of no particular account, looking into estate management?" "Yes." She sat down at the table, not because she needed to sit, but because she needed the desk's edge under her hands, the particular solidity of it. "When your solicitor says your grace to you," she said, "and the drawing-room hears it, what does Lady Hargrove understand about the deed to this estate?" He was quiet for a moment. "She understands that a duke, if he chose, could contest it." "And does she understand whether he intends to?" "She will understand," he said, "what I tell her, which is what I told my solicitor, which is what I will make as plain as necessary to every person in this neighbourhood. The deed to Ashvale is yours, Eleanor. It was left to you by a man who spent the last 3 years of his life understanding what he had caused, and it was confirmed by me 6 months before I came here, when I reviewed his will and found your name in it. I did not come back to contest it. I came back because it was the only legitimate way I could find to be in the same house as you without imposing myself on a situation I had no right to impose on." He stopped. Then, "I am aware that this is not the simple account it should have been. I am aware that I owe you a great many more conversations than one." Eleanor looked at the fire. The wood had burned down to orange, and the room was warmly lit, and outside the December wind was doing something complicated with the loose south window. And she thought about 7 years of very careful management, and about the folded letter in her writing desk, and about the boy upstairs who was watching a sparrow and did not yet know his father's name. "You said," she told him, "that you had no interest in disputing the estate." "I have none." "Then what is it," she said, "that you do have an interest in. He crossed the room and stopped at the edge of the table, close enough that she could see the cold still on his coat, the redness of his hands from the stone wall in the garden, and she did not look away. "You," he said. "Only that. For 7 years, and in whatever years remain, if you can find any reason to permit it." She did not answer immediately. This was not hesitation, it was the way she had always thought, fully and without rushing, before she offered anything she could not take back. The fire settled. The wind worked at the window. Upstairs somewhere, a child's footstep crossed the floor above the library. She reached across the table and touched the back of his hand with 2 fingers, briefly, the way you touch something you are not yet certain of and are not yet willing to leave alone. "One conversation at a time," she said. He turned his hand over. She let him hold it. The following morning, Lady Hargrove's landau departed the neighbourhood inn before 8, which the innkeeper reported to the village with great enthusiasm. Mr. Aldwych stayed 3 days, reviewed the deed with Eleanor and with the Duke's own man of business who arrived the second afternoon, and confirmed that the conveyance was clean and complete and without legitimate challenge. He departed with the comfortable expression of a solicitor whose visit has been useful. Peabody was given formal notice that his services to the estate would conclude at the end of the quarter, which he received with a tightening about the mouth that suggested he had not expected to be surprised, and was surprised anyway. James was brought down to the library on a Saturday morning in a state of mild bewilderment, having been told only that there was someone Eleanor wanted him to meet. He stood in the doorway with his characteristic stillness and looked at the man sitting at the table, and the man at the table looked back at him with an expression that Eleanor, watching from the doorway, had never seen on any face, and did not have a word for. They regarded each other for a long moment with the seriousness of 2 people who recognize, without being told, that what happens in the next few minutes will matter for a very long time. "You have my books," James said at length to the man at the table. Eleanor looked. He was right. The Duke had, without particularly intending to, sat down in the library and selected 3 books from the shelf nearest the fire, the 3 that James had left there himself, which were an atlas, a natural history, and a book about the management of kitchen gardens that James had taken from the shelves because the plates interested him, and which Eleanor had not had the heart to put back. "I beg your pardon," the Duke said, and moved them to the end of the table with an attention that was perfectly serious. "I did not know they were yours." James considered this. Then he came the rest of the way into the room and sat in the chair across the table, in the same chair where Eleanor had sat across this man many times herself, and picked up the atlas and said, "This one is about waterways. I have been looking at the Nile." "Have you?" said the Duke, and leaned forward to look. Eleanor stood in the library doorway and watched her son and his father discuss the Nile in the December morning, and the fire burned steadily in the grate, and the loose south window was no longer loose, because it had been repaired 3 days ago, and the light came through the glass as it always had in the mornings at Ashvale, warm and particular, and hers. She stepped back across the threshold into the hall. She did not need to watch it to know it was real. She had managed this house for 2 months, and she would manage it for the rest of her life, and the ledgers were balanced, and James was laughing at something she could not hear through the closed door, and the deed to Ashvale Park was in her writing desk, upstairs in the morning room where she had left it, bearing her name in full. She went to find Bess and ask about the morning's correspondence.